All right, so before we start coding, let's take a few minutes and talk about what Next.js is and why you might want to use it. I also want to take a look at some of the different types of websites that you can create. So the simple definition of Next is it's an open source web development framework for building React-based applications with server-side rendering as well as static website generation. Now, I think some people get confused because we're essentially using a framework within a framework. So I like to describe Next.js as more of a full stack environment to create your reapplications within. And you've probably built projects with Create React App, which is fine. However, those would be single page applications or SPAs, which do have some drawbacks. And Next.js provides a way for your React projects to be server-side rendered rather than having everything bundled and run on the client. And in addition to that, you can also use Next to generate static websites, which are extremely fast. So overall, just think of Next as a better way to work with React. I know a lot of developers never go back to Create React App in single page applications after using Next.js. I think that SPAs do have their place. I think they're fine for smaller applications, but if it's a full website, a larger project, large application, I think that Next.js can be very, very beneficial. Now, I do want to just take a quick look at some of the different types of projects that you might have come across. So first we have just pure static websites. Think of back to when you started learning HTML and CSS. You would create a single HTML file for every page, and you'd have some CSS files as well. So if you wanted to have an about page, you would have an about.html, and then you could go to /about.html in your browser, and it just loaded the page from the server. Now, these websites are very fast, fast load times. However, they're not dynamic. The interface isn't very interactive, which may be fine for some websites, but not for others. They're also difficult to manage because if you want to change something in the navigation or in the header, and that's on every page, you have to go to every single HTML file and change it. So very, very just tedious. All right, so as you learn more about web development, you probably learned about JavaScript and how you could use it to make your websites more interactive. You might have learned Ajax and the Fetch API and how to fetch data from the server and update the page without having to refresh the entire page. So React and other front-end frameworks like Vue and Angular took that and ran with it. So with a single page application, you can build an entire application that has one single HTML file, and all the content is loaded and updated with JavaScript. So when you go to a URL like /about, the entire page isn't reloaded in the browser. It's just that content that changes. And the advantage to this is that you get a really nice user experience, very fast and interactive. The disadvantage is the initial load time can be slower, especially for larger projects where you have a ton of JavaScript. Also, they're not very SEO friendly because everything is loaded with JavaScript, so it makes it harder for the search engines to crawl. All right, so those are single page applications. Now, server-side rendered applications are a mix of static websites and single page apps. When you go to a URL, the server will generate the HTML and CSS and send it to the browser just like a static website, but then the JavaScript will take over and make the page much more interactive and dynamic, and you can have your dynamic React components. And it's really the best of both worlds. So the initial load time is fast and the user experience is interactive and fast and seamless. And that's what Next.js is all about. In addition to server-side rendered websites, we have statically generated websites. So Next.js can be used as a static site generator, and that will generate all your HTML and CSS files at build time and then send it to the browser. And this means that the server doesn't have to do any work when a user requests a page. So this is, I would say, the fastest type of website. You can have interactive content. However, if the content changes, whether that comes from a database in a back end or a headless content management system or even markdown files, every time you change that content or add content, you have to rebuild the site and redeploy it. So it's great for things like personal blogs where you have data that isn't updating constantly, but not great for, something like where we're building a property rental website where people are constantly adding and changing data. All right, so Next.js, again, is both an SSR framework and a static site generator. You can choose the type of application you want to build, and you can mix and match. So in our project, we'll have some pages that are server rendered and some that are statically generated. All right, so let's take a look at some of the Next.js features, and these aren't all of them. These are just kind of the main ones. So file-based routing with a SPA, so let's say you build something with Create React App, you have to install React Router as a separate package, and then you have to define all your routes within your code. With Next, we can simply create a React component, put it in the app folder or the pages folder, and it will just work. You create about.js or JSX and go to /about, and it loads that component, which is really nice. And you can have nested routes, you can have dynamic routes, and of course we'll get into that. You can also have API routes that run on the server where you can interact with databases, and in our project we'll have a lot of API routes where we'll be using MongoDB and Mongoose, which is a client, to work with our database, and we can handle get, post, put, delete requests, and we don't have to have any kind of express backend or use any server-side framework. React server components, so these are just React components that render on the server, great for SEO and fast load times. You can have things like API keys that aren't visible to the client, but there are some rules to follow. For instance, you can't have hooks. You can't have event listeners and stuff with React server components. You can fetch data, so you can fetch data without having to use a useEffect hook. So basically, when the page loads, the data that you fetch will load with it. Environment variables, so Next.js supports .env files, and this is usually where you store things like your API keys, your MongoDB connect string, things like that. Customizable head tags, meta tags. Since our pages are server rendered, we can easily add meta tags to the head just by exporting a metadata object, and this is great for SEO. Image optimization, so there's an image component that we'll use instead of the HTML IMG tag, and this will allow us to optimize our images and utilize things like lazy loading. So Next.js also will give you automatic code splitting. It splits JavaScript bundles based on the page boundaries, resulting in smaller initial bundle sizes and faster page loads. Next.js also has built-in TypeScript support, providing static typing and improving tooling for type safety. And then there's built-in support for CSS that allows developers to use CSS modules, CSS in JS libraries like style components, global CSS files, and you also have Tailwind right out of the box, which is what we'll be using. And then you also have a dev server with fast refresh, a feature that enables instant feedback on code changes during development without losing component state. All right, so those are just some of the major features of Next.js. Now we're going to move on and start to create our environment so that we can utilize all these features.